Chapter 3: Retention and Onboarding. In the long run, sustained success is far more desirable than achieving a single flash-in-the-pan hit. To ensure longevity, a developer needs to produce a series of games that have a lasting impact on players, or else a single title capable of holding on to players long after release. Instead of focusing solely on convincing players that our games are worthy of their hard-earned cash, we should ask how the experiences we create can convince players that our games are worthy of their time. But how can we keep players invested from beginning to end? A critical realization is that players' needs can shift drastically as they progress through a game. Over time, players evolve from requiring instruction and assistance to freedom, challenge, and sufficient engagement for long-term replayability. If we can understand and account for these changing needs accordingly, then we can provide experiences capable of calling players back time and time again. A game's introductory phase is responsible for teaching players the basics and providing a hook to sustain continued interest, a combined effort often referred to as onboarding. During the first phases of a game, the novelty of seeing a game's mechanics, world, and characters for the first time can help keep players engaged. After they come to grasp the basics, a game can no longer depend on this initial novelty to preserve engagement. From this point forward, new content can be introduced sparingly to ensure players will still have something to discover. However, without a limitless budget, it is impossible to continuously surprise players to keep their attention. Ultimately, the pattern of basic interactions players will repeat over and over, the core game loop, must be compelling enough to sustain player interest. Setting players up to understand and enjoy this core loop is something that needs to happen during onboarding. The act of shepherding players on their journey to learn a game's mechanics poses several challenges, but it can all be addressed by accounting for characteristics of a game's target audience and basic interaction design principles. With this in mind, let's use this chapter to discuss our first task in designing a complete experience: helping players learn what to do. The tutorial is the part of the game intended to teach you how to play. As a designer, you might view your goal here as making players aware of what they can do and telling them how to do it. The most obvious way to accomplish this is to create an info dump, which is listing out instructions for everything players can do before the game starts. There are several problems with this method. For example, reading a list of actions is not interactive or engaging. Presenting everything at once can overwhelm players. Some information may be irrelevant until much later in the game, and players are robbed of the chance to discover things for themselves. The learning process is a fundamental part of the player experience. We need to convey information in such a way that they aren't overwhelmed or confused, while also making learning engaging and rewarding. There is an unmistakable pattern in poor tutorial design, and that is the disconnect between tutorial and game. To make learning a rewarding journey, our first step is to stop thinking about the tutorial as some separate entity. Instead, we should view player learning as a continuous process, and focus on making sure that each lesson we teach is engaging and fits within the broader context of the game. There is no blueprint for accomplishing this flawlessly, but there are a few critical pieces of advice which will take us from a poorly crafted learning experience to an effective and engaging one. If the initial learning curve of a game doesn't feel like part of the experience players were hoping to get, you risk losing them, even if the rest of the game delivers that experience perfectly. Ideally, learning should be integrated into players' experience to the extent that this disconnect disappears entirely. This has been an area of continuous improvement in game design over the past several years. Let's look at an example. In the first Assassin's Creed, the tutorial takes place in a foggy void instead of the richly detailed environments of the game. A disembodied voice instructs players on how to do different things. This isn't terrible, but it can break immersion. In Assassin's Creed 2, on the other hand, the tutorial is integrated into the gameplay more smoothly. Mechanics are taught during scripted sequences that kick off the game's narrative. While it's still obvious to the player that they're learning something, the learning is occurring much more organically in the game's world, with character and story development occurring alongside. This can make the learning process feel more enjoyable and engaging. In general, we can do a few things to make learning feel like a more cohesive part of the game experience. Learning should occur in the game's world, not outside of it. In games with a significant story component, players should learn about aspects of the story as they learn to play. Give players some freedom, and remember that a player's attention can be fickle. In games, we can identify three main ways of teaching players. We can tell players information in writing or through a voice clip. This is straightforward, but can feel a bit heavy-handed. We can show players information by guiding them to witness an event in the game's world. This can be very effective, even for communicating very basic information. We can also create an opportunity where players need to do something that they will learn from as a result. This is the most directly engaging for players, but we can also run into the risk of getting players stuck. It may be better to think of the three categories as inactive, active, and interactive. It is also important to note that different methods can and should be used in combination. A good rule of thumb is that, for anything you tell or show players, you should also have them do something, which reinforces their knowledge immediately or soon after. In speaking of challenge, you'll often hear the term difficulty curve, a description of how challenge grows and changes during a game. A smooth difficulty curve is one that gradually becomes harder over time, increasing challenge to match player skill. A steep difficulty curve accelerates quickly, requiring players to practice before moving on, or else fail repeatedly on their road to mastery. Drawing out such a curve is a good exercise to understand how challenge evolves over time and different titles. We can use the same tool to understand the pace of instruction in a game. Put another way, we can visualize a complexity curve, tracking how much new information is delivered to players over a given section of gameplay. This helps us to understand how much we are asking players to take in, process, and remember over time, watching out for any spikes that might cause an undesirable hiccup in understanding or memory. Here's some general advice for pacing the delivery of information to players. First, mechanics should be introduced as they are needed, rather than all at once. The benefit of such an approach is twofold. Firstly, it prevents players from forgetting knowledge introduced far in advance of its application. Second, it allows for new content to be introduced throughout the game, helping to extend the game's novelty factor and facilitate moments of additional player discovery. Another important thing to note is that pacing should consider the prior experience of your target audience. If you can correctly assume that your players have extensive experience in the genre, pacing can be increased. If you are targeting novice players or young children, pacing should be slowed. Matching pacing to your target audience is always a good decision. An even better one, however, is to give players some flexibility in how they will experience this initial learning phase. Provide a chance for less familiar players to move forward at their own pace, while letting stronger players surge ahead. A concept strongly tied to the pacing of learning is the level of instruction given. Just as pacing can vary between inaccessibly fast and painfully slow, level of instruction can vary between confusingly absent and mind-bendingly excessive. Suppose we want to teach the player how to jump by pressing the A button on their gamepad. Here's how we can do it. We can provide no explicit instruction. Alternatively, we can provide low level of instruction, such as an on-screen icon of the A button by the text jump. Or we can provide high level of instruction, such as a character stating the importance of jumping. The risk associated with providing a greater level of explicit instruction is the perception of unnecessary hand-holding, a particular risk for players with a degree of prior skills. A high level of instruction is not always as justified or welcome by players. You might call this death by instruction, where instructions are stretched out and repeated for even simple actions. Simple lessons don't demand that players are repeatedly hit over the head with instruction before being allowed to proceed. Unfortunately, this misstep is often accompanied by sluggish pacing. Simply toning down the level of instruction can be an appropriate remedy for this issue. This is often a question of stepping back and asking what instructions are strictly necessary for players to learn the intended information. As a general takeaway, there are a couple of rules we can use to determine what level of instruction is appropriate. Very young players might struggle with complex instructions and require a more gradual introduction of content. For interactions which are common in similar games and display sufficient external consistency, the overall need for instruction is lowered. For interactions introduced later in a game, the level of instructions required for new additions can be reduced as a game progresses. Finessing the level of instruction isn't always a black and white question of removing or adding instructions. Contextual instructions can be used to prevent a tutorial from feeling condescending to skilled players while lending a helping hand to players if they are struggling. These additional instructions layered on top of what a game will offer no matter what may be triggered by different conditions, such as players taking a certain amount of time to complete an expected action or failing repeatedly at a particular task. Picture this. You're learning to play a new action game. You're familiar enough with the genre, but still getting used to the controls, and you're learning more with every fight. The game throws a few waves of enemies at you, some aerial combat, and even a boss fight. You're about 30 minutes in when an enemy finally gets the better of you and your character dies, and then the game takes you back to the very beginning for another half hour of learning those ropes again, before you're granted the privilege of saving your progress. What I just described is the beginning of Nier Automata. Regardless of how difficult a game is intended to be, there should be some semblance of a safe environment present for learning to take place. This doesn't necessarily mean that players shouldn't be allowed to fail, but they should be able to quickly return to whatever bested them, at least at first. Being forced through unnecessary instructions while playing a game is annoying. The longer the period of instruction, the more frustrating it becomes, and this frustration is only magnified on replay. In other words, nobody wants to sit through a boring, unskippable tutorial, especially if the information is something players already know. Simply giving players the option to skip through instructional content or access it as a separate experience can be an acceptable, even favorable solution. The optional but separate teaching approach is often suitable for games that have a great deal of interplay between resources and gameplay systems. Only playing through a game's introduction once, or being able to bypass it altogether, however, is not the only way to prevent boring players with repetitive content. Furthermore, in many cases, such a design may be undesirable for exacerbating the gap between tutorial and game. In a heavily story-based game or RPG, for instance, you may want to create a parallel between the player's learning and the learning of their character in-universe. By necessity, this initial phase becomes an unskippable part of any future playthroughs. Breath of the Wild is an example of a game that handles this well. The starting area, the Great Plateau, allows players to learn the mechanics of the game before opening up the rest of Hyrule to them. This is not a linear experience, but rather a microcosm of the entirety of Hyrule, mirroring its open-world gameplay on a small scale. Its design allows players to learn at their own pace, which promotes player freedom. For this reason, Breath of the Wild accomplishes a broadly appealing and effective in-game introduction. First impressions are powerful, in life and in games. A player's first 20 minutes with your game will likely decide whether they return for several hours more, leave it to be forgotten in their catalog, or uninstalled entirely. Recognizing the importance of the onboarding phase and player learning is an important first step in designing a successful initial experience. The main takeaway is this: a player's first interactions with your game need to reflect the highest quality on offer throughout the entire game experience. The vital learning that occurs during the stage needs to be not only effective, but engaging. After all, players are there to play. You need to let them. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the book for more concrete examples and exercises. Scanning the QR code here will take you to the store page. In the book, you will also find an exclusive interview with Ramona Ramzan, producer at No Code Studio.